When we take a look at this case study with Martin and Mrs. Arthurs and really honing in on collaboration with our related service providers and instructionally, we can identify procedurally what should be happening through what's defined through IDEA, but also subjectively and substantively what's happening, best practice, and what should be happening for Martin and Mrs. Arthurs. Let's start with procedurally, frankly, because it's a little bit easier. I've given you a website to take a look at directly from the law from IDEA, but also the following slide has a good summary from the Promoting Progress tip sheet of what we're required by law to provide for related services. It really focuses on the where and the when, the types of service that are needed, the means of delivery, and the frequency and location of services. Those are clearly defined both in the law and in the IEP. That usually takes care of that issue unless we've got some missing. The why behind it is also identified in the law, and it's kind of general, and I think that's where the subjective piece pulls through. The why for providing related services is to assist the student with a disability to benefit from special education and also to have that access to general education. So when we think about that directly applied to Martin, we know that he's struggling academically. His reading is below grade level, but Mrs. Arthur says that's coming. She's really concerned about his writing. And this is a place where maybe the OT could step in. We don't know exactly what it says on his IEP for the where and the when of these services, but we know he has this support identified and available. The variable behaviors that Martin is having is kind of the team's responsibility. We have some specific examples, but we know that Mrs. Arthurs is struggling. And this goes back to the perspectives of the different members of the team, who's going to own that piece, who's going to drive that piece, and how the whole team is going to collaborate when it comes to helping Martin with his behaviors in the classroom, in the school, and to be a collective member of that fourth grade classroom. There are some real issues with the speech and language services that are being provided. We're assuming that procedurally they're in the IEP. We know that there's a where and a when. We do know that the general education teacher is a little bit frustrated. She states that the speech and language pathologist comes in and watches and sits and observes. And then when the speech person pulls Martin, he comes back very agitated and with some of those variable behaviors that we have going on. So this is a good example of where procedurally the speech and language practices or services are being provided, but I don't feel very good about the way they're described for both Mrs. Arthurs and for Martin. We also have a late add of a paraprofessional that we're going to really have to deal with when it comes to providing instructional services. And also, a surprise, an ASD specialist and a physical therapist that Mrs. Arthurs has never spoken to. So there isn't really a team going on there. We have to probably assume in this case that Martin is getting all of his services procedurally. On paper, this IEP and these services in this plan probably meets the law for where and when and why. Subjectively, something's falling apart, and that usually points to a problem with collaboration. This general education teacher is feeling frustrated, probably isolated, and definitely overwhelmed. The law is probably being met, but there are still issues and problems that need to be identified and dealt with. I'll go back to what we talked about earlier. Time is likely a huge factor here and something that one of the members of the team is going to have to pull together and creatively solve for. Or maybe it's a communication piece. We might not leap right to time. Maybe we leap to communication. Again, what I think is most important that we recognize here is even though it may look on the surface like procedurally needs are being addressed We have to question and really honor what Mrs. Arthurs is asking and saying, in that she doesn't feel that Martin is really getting the education he deserves because of the pieces aren't all working together. Consider those things as you consider this case study and really directly apply it to how we work with, how we're expected to work with, and the best practices behind working with related service providers.